It's been an 8-year-long generation. Not even Nintendo could have predicted just how popular and long-lasting the Switch would be. It's their highest-selling machine of all time besides the Nintendo DS, and naturally it amassed a huge library of games. So now it's time to look back at the best the Switch had to offer and see which games will have a lasting impact. To keep this ranking tight, I won't count legacy titles from third-party publishers like the Metal Gear Solid Collection, and also none of Nintendo's own legacy games on their subscription service, because that would obscure a software retrospective unique to the Switch. Of course, this isn't a definitive list, and I'd be interested in reading about your own favorites down below. With that out of the way, from someone who has played most of what the company had released, here's my top 10 Switch single-player games from Nintendo. Some concepts don't need much explanation to make their appeal clear, like Luigi working as a Ghostbuster. As a family-friendly take on the horror-adventure genre, the original Luigi's Mansion has once showcased the GameCube's power at its launch, but despite its unique vibes, it still felt somewhat like a tech demo. Over a decade later, a new developer, Next Level Games, built upon this foundation and made a bigger adventure which now focused on environmental puzzle solving. However, the actual ghost-busting aspect felt slightly underwhelming due to the mostly generic standard enemies. Luigi's Mansion 3 then addressed this issue. It's by far the most varied game in the franchise, both in set pieces and in enemies to fight. Because while it starts relatively simple, Dimension this time boasted a wide range of settings, from dungeons to film sets, with mostly unique combat scenarios and puzzles and mechanics. Speaking of which, Luigi's Mansion 3 fully transformed the series into a proper puzzle game. While Luigi's Vacuum Cleaner only has a limited number of actions, the amount of different ideas built around a vacuum suction is quite surprising, further heightened by the ability to create a Luigi clone, which makes some rooms even more complex. One major flaw is the occasional lack of clarity regarding which map elements are interactive and the true objective of some challenges. To be clear, I absolutely appreciate games that do not hold the player's hand, so it was a positive surprise how little the game will help you out, but in a few cases the level design just isn't intuitive enough to guide players naturally. The graphics of the original Luigi's Mansion at the time were quite impressive, to the point that it still looks good today. Continuing that tradition, Luigi's Mansion 3 pushes the Switch hardware a lot, and if nothing else belongs among the must-plays of the Switch library, because it's an easy contender for the best looking game on the machine. Purists might notice that it has a different feel from other Mario games, since the Canadian development team Next Level Games went for a much more Western art style, with many twisted corners in the surroundings, similar to 90s cartoons, and character animations that feel closer to the Minions or Looney Tunes than your typical Japanese game. Nevertheless, with impressive lighting and sleek texture work, the original dollhouse concept of Luigi's Mansion came truly to life here. And it actually isn't static. Luigi can demolish or interact with most of his surroundings, not to mention that secrets are everywhere, so this isn't for nothing. It's a game with a world that feels like a living place. With tears in the eyes, the maker of Mario plus Rabbids announced Ubisoft's crossover with Nintendo's iconic plumber early during the Switch's launch year. It was acclaimed by critics and fans, but always with the caveat that the strategy gameplay was a not-so-subtle carbon copy of XCOM. Many years later, the sequel, Sparks of Hope, expanded on this formula, and it's a shame it didn't generate more buzz. For one, the turn-based combat was more dynamic and offered even more tactical possibilities on the field thanks to a bigger range of movement. For absolute strategy Philistines like myself, the difficulty level was just right. While the game has more menus and tutorials than usual for a Mario title, the gameplay is surprisingly intuitive and easy to grasp from the get-go. On top of this battle gameplay, Sparks of Hope also fleshed out the adventure elements. It has big maps and dungeons to explore, reminiscent of The Legend of Zelda, though not quite as sophisticated. You explore areas like a role-playing game, and between major battles, smaller enemies that attack during exploration lead to shorter fights reminiscent of classic JRPGs. But despite featuring many unique worlds and characters, the one thing it lacks compared to the big Mario RPG classics is the writing. The Mario characters remain relatively inactive during the storyline, making this journey through Ubisoft's space worlds to rescue a kidnapped Rosalina feel surprisingly tame. There's barely any involvement from Nintendo's characters, and even the Rabbids remain pale, because most dialogue comes from a sterile tutorial robot. Yet, it's the engaging gameplay loop of tactics and sophisticated world exploration that still puts it above some other turn-based Mario games that came out on Switch. In 2006, New Super Mario Bros. Became a sales breakthrough that revitalized the entire 2D platformer genre. However, over nearly 2 decades, multiple sequels did little to innovate in terms of gameplay or presentation, with the last innovation being multiplayer in 2009. Side-scrolling Mario was treading water. Maybe because these games stopped breaking sales records, Super Mario Wonder finally tried to bring back the wonder of Super Mario. With all new stage hazards, gameplay twists, unique backdrops, and a more playful art direction, the days of recycled low-poly Mario were finally over. The marketing focused on the so-called Wonder Seeds, which are mini challenges within each stage containing unique gameplay twists, such as transforming Mario into a cake monster or summoning giant Bowser cannons. These stage dynamics felt very similar to the Rayman Origins and Legends series, which was equally energetic. But you don't even have to go that far. Just the simple fact that I didn't know what kind of movement pattern this guy had makes this game feel more unpredictable than your average Mario or Yoshi side-scroller from past generations. Strong gameplay is at the core of Super Mario, and series inventor Shigeru Miyamoto often intervenes to cut out new characters or story elements, to the point that he even had a few bits of characterization of Mario Galaxy removed in the sequel. But the bare-bones approach made the new Super Mario Bros. Games at some point feel like map packs, with nothing to stand out. No one asked for deep storytelling in a Mario game, but simply seeing a brand new world with brand new backdrops and progression gives Mario Wonder, for the first time since the Super Nintendo, an additional sense of adventure on top of the side-scrolling. Just a few small beats that contextualize the mining stages into a rescue mission, for example, make the game feel different. And the fact that the developers were allowed to go crazy with new characters and enemies naturally also made for a new gameplay feel. The 5 new Super Mario Bros. Games were almost interchangeable among each other. Mario Wonder is not. But I wouldn't go so far to crown this the best platformer ever made or something. While Mario Wonder is reminiscent of Rayman, it doesn't quite reach that same level despite its high quality. The art style has much improved, but some stages still feel sterile. And for some reason, despite its wacky nature, Mario Wonder has some of the most uninspired boss fights in the franchise. The difficulty could have also been better balanced, and even with Mario veteran Koji Kondo supervising the music, the game really doesn't have many memorable tracks, only emphasized by throwbacks to classic tunes. If I was polemic, I could argue that some of Mario Wonder's weaker aspects are overlooked, simply because its predecessors were so uninspired by comparison. But without a doubt, it's a game that will rightfully be talked about in the future much more than any specific new Super Mario Bros. Game. Donkey Kong Country is a curious franchise. Though it originated from the Mario universe, it has carved out its own unique identity, with a distinct feel shaped by being developed outside of Japan. When it first came out on the Super Nintendo, created by British developer Rare, not only did it come with a more jazzy and moody presentation, it also wasn't so much about wacky power-ups and trippy level mechanics, but focused on a tough platform platforming challenge. The Super Mario games would become ever less demanding over time to appeal to supposed casual players, which is fine and all, but thankfully the reboot of Donkey Kong Country by the American Retro Studios stayed true to its roots, making it stand on its own to this day. Both Donkey Kong Country Returns on Wii and the sequel Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze on Wii U sent the iconic ape through remorseless obstacle courses within exotic backdrops where a rolling maneuver is your most important tool. The reboot brought a brighter, more colorful aesthetic, whereas the originals had a more somber tone by Nintendo standards. I won't lie, I prefer the old mood. But the new games shined with more dynamic set pieces and an emphasis on action elements, such as crumbling caves or exploding platforms. No level feels the same because of this constant activity in the backgrounds, which creates unique obstacles within the stages themselves. So this seems like a good opportunity to give a small shout out to the 3DS port of Returns as a rare fan of the stereoscopic 3D on that machine, because with its distinct background layers it was ironically a perfect fit for it. It's obviously impossible to demonstrate this here, but it truly feels like gaping into a 3D cartoon jungle. Anyway, both Returns and Tropical Freeze were ported to the Switch later, but it would be tough to name the superior game. If nothing else, Returns is certainly superior to its original Wii version, which still came with awkward waggle controls. But while many consider Tropical Freeze the clear winner, there are valid arguments for both games actually. Since Returns was a reboot of the first Super Nintendo game, it had a smaller room for developing its own identity. While stylistically very different from the old Rare efforts, Returns still followed the same backdrop themes from jungles to factories in the same order, and more importantly it relied on cover songs and remixes instead of creating a wholly unique soundtrack, despite the music being a big appeal of the series. Whereas Tropical Freeze featured entirely new worlds, mostly freed from the shackles of nostalgic throwbacks. This also made for a bunch of new level mechanics because, as already said, the backdrops correlate with the obstacles in each parkour. So in one world, for example, the stages go through different parts of an orchard to a candy production, while all the mechanical tools on the way create different level dynamics. On top of that, it featured a brand new soundtrack by old series composer David Wise, which wasn't just a rehash, but had its own spin on the old musical style of the franchise. Also, the Switch version of Returns might have gotten a new fur effect for Donkey and Diddy Kong, but the base game was still built for an underpowered SD console. So the art direction of Tropical Freeze comes with more detail and a much more striking color composition. On the other hand, Donkey Kong Country Returns might have the more engaging level design from a gameplay perspective, in my opinion. Tropical Freeze has a small amount of worlds, but tries to compensate with increased level length, which makes for more sprawling set pieces with an often higher amount of unique elements, but also less focused level design as a result. In DKC Returns, there might be a single stage focused entirely on a short set of spiraling platforms, which doesn't take more than a couple of minutes to beat before moving on to an entirely different stage. Tropical Freeze comes with longer parkours, which sometimes also have a slower pace overall. For example, the game often stretches a level with slow swimming sections, which were supposed to be a unique selling point. Maybe the biggest offender were the boss fights, already a weaker part of the first game. Instead of making the enemy patterns more engaging, the sequel only made them longer, with even more tedious animations and waiting times between each phase, creating excruciatingly slow battles. Then there was new secret exits, which at one point make you replay a single level multiple times with different sidekicks. These are all small things which don't break the game, but I'm just saying that Returns had a faster and less interruptive flow, which I favor on a gameplay level. Yet at the same time, I much prefer the audiovisual direction of Tropical Freeze. So frankly, if you took the best parts of each game, you might get the ultimate Donkey Kong adventure. However, deciding on which one's the best on its own might come down to your personal mood that day. Besides all the platforming and kart racing extravaganza, Super Mario also boasts a long-running career as a role-playing hero, which for many people peaked with Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, the second Paper Mario game ever made, first released on GameCube in 2004, then remastered on Nintendo Switch a couple of decades later. In theory, most of these games work in similar ways ever since the very first Super Mario RPG on Super Nintendo. You traverse small maps full of dungeons, puzzles and villages while engaging in turn-based battles which try to mix traditional menu-based fighting with action commands stemming from Mario's platforming roots. Compared to other role-playing games, the stories took an ironic spin on the Super Mario universe, with characters like Bowser and Peach acknowledging their own absurdity, and even cannon fodder like Goombas living ordinary lives. Mario inventor Shigeru Miyamoto is known to really boil down game stories to the absolute minimum, and infamously he demanded that all unique characters and story elements had to be cut out of the Paper Mario sequel called Sticker Star. This approach is understandable because above storytelling, all games need to be fun interacting with through gameplay. But it's not as universal as someone like Miyamoto would believe. Adventure games and RPGs lose their charm when surprise elements are stripped away. That's why Sticker Star felt more like a generic obstacle course than a true adventure, ultimately leading to perhaps the biggest backlash against the Mario franchise ever when they doubled down on this approach for a direct sequel. Because the original Paper Mario games already were proof that even something like Mario can work with a story. Above all, Thousand Year Door has an engaging and nicely balanced battle system which is beginner friendly, but also has just enough depth, in particular in boss battles, to be compelling. While the set pieces offer a good variety in puzzle solving and investigation gameplay, not counting some of the redundant backtracking. The original series kept itself fresh with many different and distinct adventure gameplay elements, but these things correlate with story set pieces and the writing. In the first Paper Mario games, you delve into chapters which are all unique 3 to 4 hour long plots, ranging from conventional JRPG settings like castle dungeons to much more outlandish settings like murder plots or Peach philosophizing with a Space Odyssey computer. With that in mind, something like a fighting arena, which would be an ordinary set of battle challenges in other JRPGs, is greatly elevated in Paper Mario by an in-depth wrestling plot, which then becomes a thriller. But even more traditional settings like a deserted treasure island become much more engaging through lots of witty writing and unique characters that are not bound by any franchise guidelines. Compared to later sequels which weren't allowed to introduce new characters, in the first 3 games you never knew where the journey was going. Anything from Mario's crew being kidnapped by an evil nerd lizard to mafia melodrama was possible. The biggest disappointment when I played Thousand Year Door back in the day was that the mechanics and even progression and puzzles felt very similar to the first Paper Mario. Still, it was a fresh story which gave it its own place. Now, because Nintendo is Nintendo and they can't help themselves but to always dumb down their old games for remasters, Thousand Year Door on Switch got a new cheat button with which NPCs can practically spoil nearly every step you need to make. While in theory you don't need to press it, it's still so central that it takes a bit of wonder out of the investigations. So much so that I might prefer the old release. But even that only drives home that the biggest strength lies in the writing, which is not affected by this kind of handholding. And it's not just the wacky plots and scenarios, the dialogue strikes a perfect balance between irony and witty punchlines. Not to mention that this tone perfectly carries over into battle gameplay, which, presented like a stage play, is one big meta gag. Heightened by a great art direction with paper set pieces that feel very cartoony but still atmospheric, and with lots of inventive character designs which, despite their seemingly simple nature, make for very expressive animations and very distinct appearances. What sets Thousand Year Door apart is also the world building, which features a surprising amount of detail, and I'm not talking about the graphics. There's a huge number of original NPCs which all have little backstories or even their own adventures adventures. Lots of minor characters show up at different places, write you mail and so on. The fact that the research skill provides small quips for literally all NPCs in the game makes the world feel alive. The main hub world Rogueport is actually full of lore and secrets if you search, and slowly delving into its underground depth over the course of the campaign makes for a pretty decent feeling of mystery on top of the more quirky Mario hijinks. JRPGs sometimes don't have the grandiose writing that you might remember from playing them as a youngster. This is not the case for Thousand Year Door. Its writing is quite timeless. It's aware of its Mario shenanigans, but it's not just slapstick. It's family friendly but not infantile. So despite what the Miyamotos of this world believe, Thousand Year Door is actually one of Nintendo's classics precisely because of storytelling. Bayonetta 2 might seem like a rehash of the original game, but that's not a bad thing. The first Bayonetta was impressive back in 2009 with its weirdly intriguing new universe and edgy characters, and more importantly with its innovative combat mechanics like the evasion slowdown, which made the fights feel both more intuitive and more impactful. But it certainly wasn't without its flaws. Frustrating quick-time events, tedious minigames, and some janky level design elements really stuck out. So Bayonetta 2 did just the right thing by not reinventing the wheel, but refining what already worked. Cutting all the bad minigames and QTEs, focusing entirely on what counts, which was the action. Admittedly, while the original had a grittier, more mesmerizing vibe and world building, Bayonetta 2 took the spectacle to new heights, a fact established right at the beginning. No matter how down one might feel, it's hard not to get pumped up after playing the intro of Bayonetta 2, which initiates the campaign with an explosion of high-speed chasing sequences, giant monsters demolishing an entire city, and self-indulgent characters being snarky about it. After the spectacular intro, the game slows down to focus on more traditional adventuring, before ramping up again with a plethora of over-the-top backdrops and explosive set pieces in which Bayonetta and friends brutally maltreat ridiculous angel creatures. The weapons of Bayonetta also go a little more crazy in the sequel, from chainsaws to Mario chain chomps. And there's a new power-up mode which makes attacks even more bombastic. Some hardcore fans criticize the combat system for making the game feel too simple, so I'd say any experienced player should play the sequel on hard mode, which still offers a decent challenge you won't just button mash through. Thanks to a ton of unlockables, extra modes and secrets, Bayonetta 2 offers a lot of replayability too, and its straightforward, no-nonsense level design makes it one of the Switch's most replayable go-to action titles. As impressive as a huge sandbox game like Breath of the Wild might be, there's something to be said about small games. In fact, there's an art to making a smaller title still feel like an impactful adventure. Zelda Link's Awakening came from an era where technical limitations made developers laser focused on tight level design, which was especially true for this game, because its world map and multiple dungeons had to be scaled down for the extremely limited hardware of the original Game Boy. Ultimately, this led to a succinct action-adventure experience that remained a classic for decades. Now, before you accuse me of nostalgia or something, let me say that I didn't grow up with Link's Awakening. In fact, when I first played it on the 3DS as a download, I wasn't the biggest fan. It had the right vibe, but the controls felt too convoluted. The game featured too many items for the Game Boy's 2-button setup, which led to a constant switching between items and gameplay. Not to mention that for some reason passive items like the power bracelet needed to be actively equipped, making it even more tedious to navigate. I still prefer the original pixel art over the Switch remake's toy-like aesthetic, but the gameplay improvements more than make up for it. This is a faithful remaster that's far more intuitive to play, largely because it streamlines item management. But also, compared to other games in the franchise, the maze-like structure of Link's Awakening's overworld feels like a dungeon in its own right, so the widescreen ratio and enhanced map overview make navigation smoother without sacrificing any sense of discovery. Originally, Link's Awakening was only the 4th mainline Zelda game, but the team clearly wanted to flex their creative muscles instead of opting for a more predictable iteration. In fact, Link's Awakening began as an experiment by a few Nintendo employees exploring new ideas for the hardware. Yoshiaki Koizumi, later the director of the 3D Mario series, wrote his first story for this game and refused to be constrained by previous titles. So much so that series creator Shigeru Miyamoto actually scolded him for going overboard. No longer a simple tale of rescuing a princess from the fangs of an evil pig monster, Link's Awakening aimed for something new and different. While the game still roots in the formula of Zelda 3 on Super Nintendo, aka A Link to the Past, exploring these new lands came with a whole new sense of mystery. The island of Koholint, protected by the so-called windfish, who sleeps at the top of a mountain, is drenched in a dreamy atmosphere, filled with quirky characters and surprising elements that feel unusually out of place for the series. They even consulted Mark Frost, co-director of David Lynch's famous 90s mystery show Twin Peaks, for guidance on how to create the game's dreamlike atmosphere. Now, as I've already said, you couldn't tell stories with big cutscenes on hardware like the Game Boy. Yet, Link's Awakening still leaves a lasting impression. There's just enough traits to these NPCs to make them endearing, and just enough mystery to make the dungeon crawling more compelling. Moreover, it didn't rest on the laurels of its predecessor. There are many gameplay ideas unique to Link's Awakening, from new mechanics like side-scrolling and platforming, to entirely new puzzle elements and items like an almighty Super Mario Chain Chomp. The game is around 8 hours long, but doesn't need to be any longer. In this sense, the new diorama aesthetic is a fitting metaphor. Open world games like Breath of the Wild keep expanding, but in a world saturated with these huge sprawling titles, Link's Awakening offers a refreshing change of pace. Making something quote-unquote realistically big often makes games exhausting, especially when everyone does it. Actually, games shouldn't aim for reality, they are games. Like a diorama or a ghost train, they only mimic adventure, and games like Link's Awakening nail exactly that. Because size isn't a necessity when you have such a pinpoint direction that can immediately suck you into a feeling of adventure. And being forced to focus on the essentials because of hardware limitations can more easily result in a tighter game. The Switch remaster finally fixed some of its flaws, polished the foundation, and made it truly timeless. The old action-adventure formula of the Zelda games, as groundbreaking as it was with Ocarina of Time on the N64, began to feel stale by the time Skyward Sword came out on the Wii. But then Breath of the Wild shot back into the mainstream, not just in terms of sales, but also in reception. It was hailed as one of the best open world games ever, with both fans and critics praising its new sense of adventure. In Breath of the Wild, open world meant open world. While other games often built linear stories into big maps, which you followed through GPS systems, Zelda was actually open. Icons were mostly set by the player, exploration came intuitively through the surroundings, and had virtually no limits thanks to the new climbing feature. It also gave exploration a survival atmosphere with idyllic set pieces. Losing yourself in forests or conquering seemingly unclimbable mountains, that was where the great appeal of the new formula lay. However, over the years, criticism became more noticeable, for good reason I think. One of the biggest shortcomings for many was breaking weapons. While this emphasizes the survival aspect and serves as a balancing measure in the open world, it's not the most elegant design choice. The main problem isn't necessarily that it makes combat feel clunky, especially with menus and controls that were weirdly counterintuitive coming from Nintendo. More so, it erased an appeal of the old games, which was being rewarded for exploring and puzzle solving with unique items or crazy weapons. At the same time, Breath of the Wild significantly reduced the scope of the once massive and unique dungeons. It was impressive to actually be able to climb every mountain, yet it was all the more disappointing when the reward was usually a sword that broke in the next fight. And since there were no large dungeons, it quickly became clear that beyond that you would mostly find copy-pasted challenges. All the bigger the expectations for the successor Tears of the Kingdom, which was in development longer than almost any other Zelda game. At first glance, Tears of the Kingdom seemed to repeat Breath of the Wild's issues. Weapon durability remained, and the old map served as the foundation for the new one. But actually Tears is not a rehash. In fact, it has quite a different feel despite the same basic map structure. That intimate exploring of Breath of the Wild has been discarded, kind of. Instead, Tears is bigger and more overwhelming thanks to two new open world layers, air and underground, and feels even freer due to the vertical gameplay that connects those layers. It's pretty flashy to throw yourself into the clouds via catapults or self-made vehicles, turning the old hurdles of Breath of the Wild into a stone's throw. But the most impressive thing is not that the sky is full of sights to explore. What's rather crazy is that from this macro level above, at any point you can go back to the old micro level on the ground. In a way, it's what Skyward Sword promised back in the day but didn't deliver. As banal as it sounds, some of the problems one might have had with Breath of the Wild were fixed by the sheer amount of content in Tears. There's still a few map elements that repeat too often, but wherever you launch yourself on the map, you land in vivid landscapes full of secrets and unique incentives that encourage exploration. Quite impressive. Even old Zelda-style sections were back, at least to some extent. The main dungeons haven't become much more complex, but they offer proper boss fights again, and come with more creative preludes. In other words, in Tears of the Kingdom it takes much longer before the map becomes predictable and boring. And while weapons still break too quickly, it doesn't weigh as heavily anymore, apart from the annoying menus and controls. Because also in terms of rewards, the game became much more varied. There are many more equipment pieces and upgrades, and the new summons are a bit like the old dungeon items. Plus, experimentation and exploration are rewarded a lot more through the inherent game systems. By having so much designed around efficiently traversing big distances, it's much more motivating to come up with your own solutions, emphasized by the new crafting feature. Which means it also feels like a meaningful reward to finally find a permanent source for the steering wheel component, for example. The small dungeons are still more like mini games, but can now sometimes reward players with ideas on how to make traversal even more efficient on the real map. The physics engine in Breath of the Wild fell flat because it gave you little reason to use it, whereas Tears of the Kingdom encourages experimentation much more. As a sandbox adventure, the map of Tears of the Kingdom could hardly be made any better. For those not quite convinced by Breath of the Wild, Tears offers the ultimate version of this new approach. But those who couldn't stand the new formula at all won't be happy with Tears either. You have to have tolerance for its new crafting feature, which admittedly doesn't have much to do with the old games. Personally, I also maintain that it couldn't have hurt to rebalance the weapons so they don't break and make the dungeons even bigger with even more items and many more boss fights. However, that old A Link to the Past formula just wasn't the big inspiration anymore. That old Zelda approach within an open world, meaning huge dungeons on the map which have many different enemies and boss fights that drop unique treasure with unique features at the end, that must be found elsewhere. Super Mario Odyssey had quite an impact, especially since the Mario franchise had begun to feel a bit predictable by the time of its release. While the Wii U had many problems that led to its failure, one of them was that flagship titles such as New Super Mario Bros. U and Super Mario 3D World didn't have that excitement and innovation of prior titles such as Mario 64 or Galaxy. Then came Mario Odyssey, and alongside Zelda did the heavy lifting to push the Switch far beyond the Wii U straight from the start, because it was a game that felt ambitious, on par with the biggest classics of the franchise, and above all, not like something you already played, boasting creative sandbox platforming, a new core mechanic to drastically change up Mario's moveset, accompanied by all new and unpredictable set pieces. Now, before any further adulations, unlike some dorky publications which gave it an unironic 6 out of 5 stars, I am not gonna call it perfect. For one, I'm not fond of the solution to prior camera problems by tilting it downwards. In platforming sandboxes all about verticality like the Donkey Kong Manhattan, I'd like to have a clear look skyward, yet the camera always recalibrates the other way. I can let this one off the hook because no other sandbox Mario game had a perfect camera. But another bummer is the low difficulty. Some other less demanding Mario iterations offered harder levels after the credits, and Odyssey 2 has a big post-game. However, the post-game content also fills the map with repetitive copy-paste elements. So getting through the main campaign is a little too easy, but completing the game 100% isn't that engaging either. With that out of the way, it's hard not to compliment this game for its sheer amount of unique ideas and its brisk pace, as well as its tight sandbox design, which doesn't overstay its welcome during the normal campaign. It is quite an odyssey, boasting a big number of wholly unique locations full of different gameplay mechanics and gimmicks, while you never know where you might land next, be it a Jurassic Park or the already mentioned Mario Manhattan. Even the aesthetics offer a wide range of stylistic choices, from realistic cities and fortresses to colorful backdrops and low poly art, giving you the sense of traveling through a world full of unique lands. And the art direction provides enough context that each biome feels like an actual place, not just like an abstract obstacle course. And I haven't even mentioned the new core mechanic yet, Mario's ability to transform into all enemies in the game, which creates lots of different gameplay styles and different types of parkours, because the moveset of a chain chomp is different from that of a flying Goomba. At first I wasn't a fan of how this made Mario's traditional forward dive more complicated with an additional button press. However, the new extra cap bounce is a decent compensation that allows for a different kind and still engaging flexibility within these sandboxes. Ultimately, Mario Odyssey nails the core of what made the franchise as iconic as it is: highly polished gameplay, a focus on making the mere act of moving around interesting, as well as a high amount of surprise elements. And with that, it was almost like the antithesis to its direct predecessors, which slowly began to tread water. Among Nintendo's most iconic action-adventure games, Metroid Prime might have not been the mainstream phenomenon that Zelda Ocarina of Time was a few years before it. However, for many who played it at launch, it had a similar impact. At the urging of Mario inventor Shigeru Miyamoto, the Texas-based Nintendo newcomers Retro Studios had turned the old Metroid concept of exploring 2D mazes into a first-person adventure. Similar to its predecessors, Bounty Hunter Samus Aran crashes on a deserted planet, which players must conquer by using their wit. While the original 2D Metroid series eventually became more focused on action platforming, Metroid Prime focused on slower, more immersive exploration. And to this end, the first-person perspective was fully leveraged. Seeing reflections inside the helmet or the raindrops on the visor caused quite the astonishment in 2002. Not to mention that the world had incredible detail, while tricks like hiding loading times behind door animations made it feel seamless. The scanning mechanic was particularly ingenious, as players used the visor to collect information about the world and organically solve environmental puzzles. No part of the exploration feels artificial. While the Switch remaster gave the game more traditional shooter controls, Metroid Prime is not a shooter. Sounds weird, but that's the deal. There is quite a bit of shooting, but it's not the core of the game. Trying to play it like competitive shooters would miss the point. It's more like Legend of Zelda or Dark Souls in first person. That's why battles also work with a similar target lock-on, because much more important than combat is the careful investigation of the alien terrain. The backtracking is not as elegant as in the more compact Super Metroid, but the world building is much more sophisticated, especially in relation to the gameplay. Many sections test your jumping skills similar to the original 2D Metroid, but more often you'll analyze anomalies in the environment using your spacesuit's various scan functions and abilities, while the story is completely optional for you to follow or not. The board computer provides hints, but they fit naturally into the scanning gameplay instead of feeling like artificial handholding, and obstacles like water or darkness, along with many puzzles, feel like a natural part of the world rather than mere upgrade barriers. Rarely has it been so intuitive and immersive to explore ancient temples, sunken spaceships and fallen sanctuaries. Kenji Yamamoto's music adds the finishing touch. Metroid Prime has one of the best gaming soundtracks of all time, perfectly capturing an atmosphere of melancholy, isolation and the extraterrestrial. Even 20 years after its original release, the remake of Metroid Prime still stood on its own, especially looking at some of the regressions seen in many other adventure games of the time. Instead of relying on immersion and intuitive level design, many other games took the cheap route and relied on gigantic icons and glowing breadcrumbs to lead players. A far cry from a top Metroidvania and action-adventure like this. Metroid Prime never achieved huge mainstream success, but among fans it rightfully remains a milestone for immersive gameplay concepts.